Hey folks, this is a new episode of Composing with Buck and Cage, and today I want to address some of the issues of algorithmic composition in general. I've been posting these videos about composing with Buck and Cage and in general algorithmic composition, and some of you might be thinking, why should I use algorithmic composition and what is it for? So I addressed some of these issues in the first video, I guess, but I want to kind of follow up on that general idea and give some more insights about algorithmic compositions in general, and then address some of my own thoughts about it. Some people might think that this is just a shortcut to compose, so to make the hard task of composition easier using some predetermined calculations, and that can be the case in some instances. But I argue that algorithmic composition can be a thought out and controlled process. As much as traditional composition is. What algorithmic composition does is allows the composer to generate material that can, first of all, expand the palette of the composer's own musical thinking, even dare the composer to claim some of the music that is being output by the algorithm as his own. As John Cage put it, I have become a listener. That's what he says, meaning that he first and foremost listened to sounds and soundscapes as music, rather than trying to impose his own compositional agency on a piece of music. So, of course, John Cage is a particular case, but the idea of the composer as a listener I think is an interesting one and can be incorporated into the algorithmic composition process. Two problems with considering algorithmic composition as a simple shortcut to composition. The first one, I would say, is how do we design the algorithm? What kind of process we need to put in place, and that requires some compositional thinking. Whenever we start generating material with the algorithm we design, then the first thing that algorithmic composer does is check whether this algorithm is reflective of the idea that was the impetus behind the design of the algorithm. The tweaking it is in itself compositional process where we go back to the algorithm and start changing the parameters or changing the design of the algorithm itself, and that can actually lead the composer to revisit some of the choices, to take different routes in the composition, and in a way that is not very dissimilar to a more traditional approach to composition. Even if we have randomness in our algorithm, then we still have to make decisions about many different parameters that we can control. For instance, we can decide how many notes we generate with that random process, what's the register of those notes, what's the thickness of the rhythmic texture. All sorts of things need to be decided when we are composing. And actually, speaking about randomness, that's a thorny issue in algorithmic composition. And it's an issue that it's been illustrated historically by two very important composers of the 20th century, namely the aforementioned John Cage and Pierre Boulez, who was composer and conductor. At the beginning, they were actually good buddies. They were friends, and they were admiring one another. But then increasingly their relationship soured. And I would argue that soured mostly because of their approach to randomness. And while Cage was absolutely fine with giving up compositional agency over his compositions, meaning allowing randomness to take over and pretty much abandoning the idea of the composer as the shaper of music in each and every way, Boulez actually used an algorithmic approach to achieve even more control over each and every detail of his compositions. So where they started from similar approaches, where they explored different ways and untraditional ways of composing, but they took it in opposite direction. I want to bring in my 2 cents here. My approach to algorithmic composition is that what's central about the process, the algorithmic process, is still the idea that we want to convey in a composition. So the idea that the musical idea that is the impetus for us to write some music has to be the guiding principle of algorithmic composition. So as I mentioned before, once we design the algorithm, we can check with us whether that a particular result is reflective of our initial idea. I was once attending a lecture by David Lynch, of all people. And he was talking about his process. And if you know his films, they are really, they don't follow a linear thinking, that they're not really absolutely rational. But I was surprised how rational he was about describing his process and saying that when he has an idea, he wants to accomplish the idea and he tries to get closer and closer to that idea. And he said that if I get to 95% or 96%, he kind of insisted on the percentage figure there, which I thought it was pretty funny. But he was very specific about being attached to his initial idea and vision. And I would argue that that's a good way of going about algorithmic composition as well. So we can have an initial idea and then start generating, using algorithm to get closer and closer to the idea. But we also need to be able to go back and tweak and change either parameters or the design of the algorithm itself to get to that specific idea as close as we can. At some point, we do need to release the work into the world. Algorithmic composition can be used to generate randomness, and if your initial idea is pure randomness, and then by all means that's what you should do. And algorithmic composition is a good tool to get to that. But I would argue that algorithmic composition has more to offer. There's another issue that I would like to address, which might sound a bit esoteric, but I think it's very important, at least to my process, and it is finding the right middle between randomness and predictability. So if we listen to a pattern that is completely random, so there is no inner generative principle behind, then we get bored of it pretty easily. While if we have something that is very predictable and repetitive, we also get bored pretty easily. And I think there is a right middle where there is a hidden process, a pattern that it's there, but we cannot really put a finger on. Humans are good at recognizing patterns, but we're not necessarily able to explain what the pattern does, and that's a kind of thinking that is the distinction between like conscious rational thinking and the more holistic thinking. I think when we have a pattern that is interesting and it's kind of hidden, so we can tell it's there, but it's not predictable, then we kind of stop hearing the music with our conscious brain and start hearing it holistically. And I think that's part of the reason why some music is very satisfying, is because we eventually gave up our rational thinking. So I'm doing a poor job at describing this phenomenon, but if you want to know more about this, there is a book that I find really interesting and that has really kind of influenced my thinking about the matter, and it's called The Master and His Emissary. And it's not necessarily a book about music, even though it does talk a lot about music. And it's a book that describes two different ways of thinking based on our two brain hemispheres, the right side and the left side. So if you're interested, I strongly suggest you to check that out.